18 of the HubZone Small Business Virtual Summit. I see the numbers trickling in, and I'm so excited you guys are all joining us here today. This webinar will be recorded and available in the virtual event platform. Now, I do realize that we did send this notice out to some attendees that may not be registered to participate with the virtual summit. So I wanted to let you know that in order to access the recording and or the slides, you will have to be a registered participant of the virtual summit. We have a great speaker with us today, John Shiraka of GovCon Pros. Many of you have probably come across Mr. Shiraka in the past, as he has been a key player in the Small Business Administration and very influential in shaping policies and legislation that have been instrumental in supporting the small business community. A lot has been happening under different administration changes. I'm really excited for him to be here today to explain to us about government procurement trends, what you should be expecting, and how you can be preparing for the next fiscal year. This webinar is structured to have a Q&A function, so we encourage individuals to type your questions in the Q&A field or leverage the chat function. Mr. Shiraka enjoys an interactive discussion, so he encourages questions. Throughout the presentation, he will provide different opportunities for you to monitor questions. I will be behind the scenes monitoring them, but if you guys have any issues or concerns, feel free to post them in the chat. But again, without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Shiraka. I realize that we still have some numbers trickling in, but we'll just keep moving forward, okay? And without further ado, Mr. Shiraka, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Burnett. I appreciate the introduction. I am delighted to be here this morning. I appreciate the fact that we do want to keep it interactive. If there are questions, please send them along as we go through. I did want to congratulate Michelle and the HubZone team for an excellent in-live session and conference last week. Very impressive, lots of discussions, lots of key players, both from the SBA and industry, so congratulations on that. I did want to talk today about sort of the trends that we're seeing, right? And what does that mean for federal contracting in particular? So it's one thing to sort of just talk about rule changes, talk about what the priorities are of the administration, and talk about potential statutory provisions. But it's, at least in my mind, very important to see sort of what do those trends mean for small businesses and HubZone small businesses in particular as we look at the next year, 18 months, 24 months, et cetera. So what we'll try to do is talk a little bit about the trends that we've been seeing, and then also talk a little bit about the priorities that the federal government has. I do want to talk about category management and the challenges around that, and sort of what are the fixes, or what is the administration thinking about, and what are some of the best practices. And definitely, as Michelle said, as we go through, if there are questions, just send them in. I'll try to pause every so often and address those questions. So what are we seeing with respect to federal contracting spend? Obviously, we've been through a pandemic. We've experienced some, it's been unclear, and there's been uncertainty. And whenever we see that, the market tends to shrink. But what we saw as a result of the pandemic is that spend actually went up, right? So obviously there was the CARES Act. There was a lot of response to the pandemic. So spend, if you look at 2020, it was $681 billion, and that's over, since 2016, it was a 43% increase. A significant portion of the spend, though, happened as a result of COVID-19 funding, right? And what happened as a result of that, sort of what we saw over the last several months, year, 12, 18 months, is that spend went up, but it didn't particularly help firms that were new to the marketplace. Because what happened is, as things started to shut down, as we started to see less networking, less events, less matchmaking, there wasn't an opportunity for new entrants to participate in the marketplace. So what agencies did is if they had to procure goods, if they had to procure services, they tended to rely on existing relationships. So there was, and what we saw with our clients is after the pandemic, we saw sort of an initial downturn, but with a sort of consistent upturn after a few months. And that's indicative of the spend. It's indicative of staying with existing vendors, et cetera. And that's one of the reasons as we see sort of the regulatory changes and authorities from Congress. That was one of the reasons why 8A companies received an additional year in the program, because they really didn't have a lot of opportunity to do business development. You know, it's a 9-year program. That first year or that year of COVID, I guess we're still going through it, was a challenge. And so there was an additional year attached to the 8A program, or an extension of the 8A program. Obviously, with respect to where we've seen significant growth is as a response to the pandemic, right? So medical services, obviously on top, research and development. And then what we've also sort of seen, which is more consistent with just growth in federal government, is professional services and IT services. One of the issues that many of you are aware of is the IT cybersecurity sort of breaches in the federal government. And there is significant initiative and focus on trying to address that. So with respect to professional services and IT and cybersecurity, and you know, when we talk about contractors and CMMC, those trends will continue, at least in our opinion, those trends will continue to prevail. And so we should see a consistent spend in those areas. Obviously, the spend with respect to the pandemic, we're still facing challenges, but we probably will see a reduction in those types of spend. And then the last point on this chart is, you know, we saw $144 billion not between 19 and 20 awarded to small businesses. Here's a chart just sort of indicating how and what we've seen grow over the last years. And again, dollars have been going up, percentages have been going up as well. But when we talk about category management, you know, we'll sort of talk about the fact that percentages are going up, but the number of small businesses actually participating in federal contracting are going down. And one of the things that came out, and I actually wasn't aware of this, but one of the my co-panelists at the session shared with me, Tim, was that even though new contracts to small businesses are going down, so we'll see that, and entrants getting contracts are going down, the number of firms actually registering with SAM to work with the federal government is actually going up. So we're seeing more firms trying to work with the federal government, but significantly less firms actually achieving it. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I'll stop right there, Michelle, to see if there's any questions on sort of that first set of slides. I don't know if there are any, but.
Not yet, but I do know most of the companies that are on here. So a lot of these companies are very familiar with this whole trend. So I'm not surprised that we don't have questions here. I don't think you're going to get out of this whole thing unscathed though. So, you know.
Okay. Thanks,
So
Michelle.
we can keep moving forward.
Okay, so as we see the new administration come in, right now they've had an opportunity to sort of set out their agenda and set out their statutory and regulatory priorities. We've seen some of the priorities make its way into proposed legislation, and I know Madison Services Group did a great job of sort of talking through those. I think when it comes to federal contracting, there are particular areas where the administration is going to uh, focus on, right? And this started with discussions during the Biden campaign. It has sort of taken a life of its own with respect to who's been nominated for the various positions, but it's also been provisions that have been attached to different bills, some of them making it through and some of it not making it through. But we sort of understand what the focus is. And, talking with various small business offices, both at the Hub Zone Council Conference and then over the summer in various conferences, including the Reservation Economics Summit, there's a significant focus not only on increasing the goals, right? So we've talked about the initiative, and it's it's been out there for a number of months now with respect to increasing the 8A and small disadvantaged business goals from 5% to 15%. But there's a significant discussion with respect to not just looking at the 8A goal, right? So if we're going to increase the 8A goal, the discussion has been it would be unfair not to really look at the various other goals and raise those as well. And I apologize, you guys might be hearing my dogs that like to hang out with me. One likes to play with this toy and the other one scratches her collar. So I apologize if you're hearing that. What's that, Michelle?
I said, it's not bad. It's not overshadowing you and all of us. It actually probably makes us feel better knowing that, because it happens to all of us.
Okay. So, there has been significant discussion on the Hill with respect to raising all the goals subsequently in concert with raising the 8A goal. And then the other question is, look, it'll take statutory change to officially raise the goals, but at some point the administration may feel that they will just set targets for the agencies themselves. Obviously, that's not a long-term fix, but that would be a target for this administration and the executive branch. And then when we talk about increasing goals, the administration isn't entirely focused on just hitting a higher percentage, right? There's a significant initiative. And if you talk to any small business office, they'll say, look, we've been asked to cast a broader net, bring in non-traditional actors or participants, and change the trend that we've been seeing with fewer and fewer small businesses either entering and being successful, or fewer and fewer small businesses just getting one-off contracts. And obviously, when we see consolidation, when we see category management, that's one of the challenges or barriers. There's others that we actually discussed at the conference. And I think, there's a lot of hurdles to just become a federal contractor now with respect to some of the requirements, the ISO requirements, the CMMC requirements. So there are barriers. But one of the significant barriers is category management. And then the other thing that's being considered also, and I may touch on all of these, I may not, but the other thing that's being considered also is increasing the simplified acquisition threshold. So as you guys know, as sophisticated federal contractors, it's easier for a new entrant to play in that marketplace, right? But it's limited to $250,000. And so as you grow, that's not a very attractive place to be, although it's much more simple to comply. So the idea is if that's raised to about $1 million, it'll encourage new entrants, non-traditional participants to play in the marketplace and bring in an innovation into federal contracting. So that's one thing that's also being considered.
Do you think that if it raises, Sean, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you,
No, go ahead.
that they'll increase the requirements in regards to what contracting officers will have to do? Or do you think that they'll keep it relatively consistent to the current process? Because that's a huge jump, which is great, but the question is that going to lead to more bureaucratic hoops as it pertains to simplified acquisition?
No, so the idea is, so two things. One is during the Obama administration, we actually almost were successful in raising it to 500,000. And we got pretty close with the Office of Federal Procurement Policy. And at the last instant, and I can't explain this to anybody for the life of me, but in the last instant, the Office of International Trade, and I forget the name of the office, but the office that negotiates international trade and international compacts, et cetera, objected because the Canadian government had objected. For the life of me, I can't exactly understand what the impact was to Canadian firms. But so there had originally been discussions with respect to increasing it to 500,000. So given the circumstances we're in, $1 million is actually pretty well accepted across the board. And yes, the entire intent is to be able to have the simplified acquisition procedures remain as is, if exactly for that reason, Michelle, to allow small businesses to be able to easily participate, streamline up to $1 million, and thus encourage, newer, smaller, innovative companies to participate without a lot of bureaucracy. That's really the intent.
So we do have one question before you move on. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, Melanie indicated that the simplified acquisition was temporarily raised under COVID emergency declaration to 750. Is that still in place?
So that, my understanding is that expired, and I'd have to go back and actually look at the CARES Act. So you're absolutely right. It was increased. And that's another example, right? So it was increased as a result of the pandemic and the CARES Act. My understanding is that sunset, but I'll have to confirm that, Michelle.
I believe, I do believe that it did expire, because when FEMA was doing, I think it was along the lines with the expiration of FEMA's RFI, that they had that open RFI for services. But, maybe that would be a way for us to be able to prove that, raising it would have a positive return. So I don't know if there's been an analysis done on that or not, but this is a question for me. Is there anything that we should be doing right now? Like, should we be doing a call to action, or is it a little bit too premeditated?
No, I think actually there's two things that I think as a advocacy group make a lot of sense. And I sort of clump them together. The increase in simplified acquisition threshold actually allowed the government a lot of flexibility in being able to respond to the pandemics, right? So I think it's important to have some sort of language with respect to disaster response and how the government responds automatically. So I don't know, Michelle, if you're familiar with the Stafford Act, but the Stafford Act, okay, so that's something I used to hang my hat on when I was at the SBA, right? And as soon as we had a presidentially declared emergency, I would reach out to all our PCRs and say, hey, you have to make sure that whatever spend occurs as a result of this disaster, and disaster spend is always coded, it goes small and it goes local. And the small part, I would kind of stretch, because if you really read the Stafford Act, it really focuses on local, but my assumption was always, well, the Congress meant small also. So we would really push the spend to go small and local. I think there needs to be, and there was discussion about this initially after the pandemic, was revising response authorities in two ways. One is to, like you guys just pointed out, increase the simplified acquisition threshold to give flexibility to the government. So we don't have to have another act. It just happens automatically, right? And then the other would be, and this is a little bit more controversial, is that, look, one of the easy buttons for the federal government as in the pandemic was sole source. So if they needed something really quickly, it was really easy for them to sole source to 8A companies. And the threshold is much higher for tribally Alaskan Native Hawaiian owned companies. One of the things that I had a discussion with the Hill on was, look, if we're not going to have sole source authority, and I know this is a big discussion similar to 8A and in the other socio categories, and they'll always say, well, that's a business development plan and it's a 9-year program, and that's why they have that sole source authority. Got it. But in the case of a disaster, the federal government should have access to the best and the brightest, no matter what their socio category is, right? So in the case of a disaster, we should have automatic kick in of sole source authority for the other socio categories so that the government can get access to them. And by the way, that also helps economic development with all those other categories, as well as that money is spent in the case as a response to the disaster. So that's another thing that's being considered. And Michelle, I don't think it's too soon to have a discussion with the committees about, we are supportive of those initiatives. And then some of the other things that this administration is looking at, and was a major part of the Biden's campaign, is access to capital, right? So especially with government contractors, and the challenge with financing, mobilization, and bonding, there's a lot of different provisions that have been considered with respect to that. Nothing has been formalized. And then when we talk about oversight, you guys, when we had this discussion at the conference last week, when I ran the programs, we had something like 119 procurement center representatives, in which I thought was incredibly understaffed, because they staff thousands and thousands of buying activities across the country. And so now my understanding is they're below 70, maybe even as low as 50. I don't know if you have an actual number, Michelle, but they're incredibly understaffed. And I know the Montgomery County Chamber has engaged with, because you can engage with the oversight folks on the small business committees, but then there's the appropriation folks, which is the totally different committee. And so I know the Montgomery County Chamber folks have engaged with appropriations to discuss how SBA is funded and where that funding should be focused on. I know that this administration is very concerned about some of those small business offices sort of being defunded and sort of being set aside over the last 5 years. And so re-emphasizing their importance and their authority is important to the administration. And then, as we talked about sort of broaching category management, there's a significant focus. I mean, there's always been a battle. When I was running these programs, we always battled with GSA and OMB with respect to category management. But there is a significant pushback around category management and the goals associated with category management. So support from advocacy groups in pushing back against category management is important. And then the two last things, look, as we see bundling and consolidation, bigger requirements, one of the only entrees into federal contracting for small businesses has been subcontracting. However, we all know that when it comes to subcontracting, you're sort of at the behest of the prime contractor. And then, I'm a great advocate for small businesses, so I'm always going to push for them. But that doesn't mean that every single large firm is bad, right? There's a ton of them out there that are good actors and try to bring up the subcontractors and mentor them and make them successful. But there is significant challenges in the subcontracting program with keeping prime contractors accountable, with transparency and the data. It's a black box. It's not like FPDS or USA Spend. And so there is focus on bringing more transparency and accountability into the subcontracting program. And then the last thing is, and this is also pretty important with respect to certification and continued compliance, is that the SBA is going to have to bring the SDVOSB program certification to the SBA and launch that across the government, right? And as they do that, what's going to be the impact because it's going to be in government contracting and business development, right? How are they going to implement that? What's going to be the impact? Are they going to have additional resources to do that? How is it going to tie into annual or every 3-year recertifications? Can there be a centralized mechanism for common requirements around ownership and control, right? If you look at all the various socio categories, there's pretty common requirements around ownership and control. Then you have various other requirements as you look at the women-owned, hub zone, 8A, et cetera. So can there be commonality to increase efficiencies? Those are things that are going to be happening over the next, I'd say 12, 18, 24 months. There's significant focus on it, but I would argue that we now have, as advocates, a chance to frame the discussion and how this gets implemented. So it's really important to remain engaged and to engage the agencies, not just even the SBA, but Office of Federal Procurement Policy and OMB, and obviously the Hill committees, because you need to sort of have pressure from all sides. And the one thing that I'll say is that, look, between 2010 and 2016, there were a significant number of small business friendly statutory, regulatory, and process provisions that came out. I will keep out category management because that was a challenge. But the way that that really worked is because we had, even though it was on the other side of the aisle, we had Emily Murphy on the House Small Business Committee, who worked very closely with us at the SBA. And then we had Joe Jordan at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, who worked very closely with us. And so it was a unique circumstance where you had OFPP, SBA, and the committees working together to sort of solve the problems and propose statutory and regulatory revisions, like the All Small Mentor Protege program, like set-asides under multiple award contracts, like the Women-Owned Small Business program and sole source under that. So it was a unique circumstance, but it's important to sort of push on all those levers. Any questions, Michelle?
I actually do have a question. So
Okay.
when you were going on about the targeted location-based, the language in the Stafford Act, and then also pinpointed about subcontracting, one of the priorities we've been trying to push was extending, because correct me if I'm wrong, I know the RISE Act allows for double credit for agencies if the work is being performed in the area. Me personally, I think that language should have always been adopted as a part of HubZone to really, facilitate and create job creation in these targeted areas. Has it only been enacted in Puerto Rico? Is there other areas in which the RISE Act has been utilized? Because I know Puerto Rico was devastating, but do you see, is there a reason why it's not being utilized in some of these more affluent disaster areas?
So I know that as far as I know, it is only Puerto Rico, and it was as a result or in response to the hurricane and the devastation there. I don't know that it's been looked at. So that's an interesting angle, Michelle. I
We're
don't
in
know.
hurricane season. I have a feeling we're
Yeah.
going to have quite a few other areas that are going to take a huge hit here. And, the RISE Act could be very beneficial, but the other component we were looking at is if it would be extended to subcontracting goals, that could really incentivize prime contractors.
You mean double credit for subcontractors? I know that was discussed at some point. I don't know. I mean, you may know better than me. I don't know if that was implemented.
It was something that actually, that's when I went out to Puerto Rico. I met with the congresswoman to try to get her to endorse it. And we've been sending a lot of requests, and we have it on our legislative priorities because we were hoping to get, obviously the congresswoman from Puerto Rico to endorse it, given the fact that only Puerto Rico had the RISE Act, because I don't see a lot of congressmen that would be like, and women going, yay, let's do it, when it doesn't help us at all. But if SBA were to start to use the RISE Act, for instance, when Houston got hit with the hurricane, that was definitely not anything anyone anticipated, but that would have been a perfect opportunity. New Orleans, things like that.
Yeah, and I don't know, so I'd have to look at that, and maybe you've done this research, Michelle. I don't know if they have the authority to extend it out of uh, Puerto Rico as a response to a disaster, or if they need statutory authority to do that,
So I
right?
thought that I didn't see when I read the language of the RISE Act that it didn't, it said that SBA had the authority to enact the RISE Act, that you were given the authority, but I don't believe that the stipulations were associated to Puerto Rico. I feel like that's just the only time that they enacted it.
Oh, okay.
Again, I might be wrong, but like
Yeah,
when I read it, that's the vibe I got. And I was just curious why it wasn't being utilized in other areas. Cause I think that they were trying to figure out, hey, is this going to be beneficial, and using Puerto Rico as
yeah,
an example, but Puerto Rico has so few government contracts. I mean, I don't feel like it gives a full depiction of how impactful this could be,
yeah.
given the fact that they're Oconus. So I
Yeah,
was
no.
curious your thoughts.
No, yeah, so I think it would be helpful. I think it would encourage engagement of those firms located in disaster areas. And I think it would help to support the Stafford Act and the ability to engage local and small. Um, my one recollection, and this was as I was leaving, and I think Rob Wong was coming in. I recall having discussions around the RISE Act specifically to Puerto Rico. I may be mistaken. I may, I'd have to go back and look at the language. My impression initially when I saw the language was that it was specific to Puerto Rico, but maybe, and so, yes, the agency had the authority to implement it, but specific to Puerto Rico. But I'd have to go back and look at that, Michelle. But it would be
I'll dig
interesting.
into it too.
Okay,
I've been
okay.
curious why.
And it'd be interesting if they had the authority to expand it, it would be a good sort of white paper or a document to send to the SBA administrator and highlighting the authorities that she has to respond to disasters. And then if it's not, if the agency doesn't have that authority, it would probably make sense in having a discussion with the Hill on expanding the authority outside of Puerto Rico.
So as a really involved member of the council and beloved, industry expert, does that mean that you're going to help me with this?
Absolutely.
Yay. And now I
I
have that
will.
on recording. I will shut up because if they're not going to ask questions, I'm totally going to take advantage of this, because if you guys haven't noticed, he is brilliant. So I have him trapped in here for a little while, so I get to pick his brain. So I will stop talking so he can go through his slides. I'm sorry about that, guys.
No, I appreciate it. I don't know about the brilliant part, Michelle, but thank you. So to talk about some of the other initiatives, you guys may have seen early on there was two executive orders that came out. One was the Buy in America, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the other was the racial equity, advancing racial equity EO. And originally, when it first came out, a lot of the focus was, oh, well, we have to increase the goal. And we talked about that, right? And now the discussion is we can't just increase, or at least I'm hoping, and I've heard the discussion is we can't just increase 8A. We've got to look at small. We got to look at the other socio categories. So that's one. But it goes well beyond that, right? So and I won't say I was disappointed. I was a little surprised that the SBA itself doesn't have an official process for this, although they may in the front office and the legal team may not be aware of it. But it goes beyond just increasing goals for socio categories. It goes beyond just numbers, right? It really is an analysis of the programs that were established to help support the underserved communities. What kind of inherent barriers are built in that actually go against implementing the desired outcomes, right? And so you could look at the Hub Zone program and you could probably come up with at least 10 or 15 barriers that are built in to the way the regs and policies and procedures were established that hinder the ability to achieve the desired outcomes of Congress. And it's really interesting because there was a lot of discussion during the campaign that there is a divide between when Congress established statutory authority and the way regulations are implemented, right? Regulations are implemented by folks at the agency who are often extremely risk averse, but also don't necessarily understand the congressional intent. And obviously that's why we talked about this, and I might have the chart in here. They go through a rulemaking process and all those things. But oftentimes they will, not intentionally, right, but they will create barriers to the actual benefits that were intended from the program. And so it's an important period of time, and all agencies are supposed to do this, right? Every agency is supposed to do an analysis, come up with a report, and submit it to the White House with respect to, hey, we engage the public, we have evaluated our programs, and we've determined that, you know, actually there are some barriers. These can either be achieved through policy, so we don't have to go through the rulemaking process, or procedural changes. They may have to be addressed through regulatory changes, or they may have to be addressed through statutory changes. And as we discussed at the conference, each of the agencies is doing this. SBA, as far as the legal folks were aware, didn't have a formulated mechanism to engage the public to respond to this. I would encourage, you know, if I had the opportunity, I would encourage, you know, advocates of the small business various programs, and the 8A program is, you know, ripe with barriers for growth in that program, because a lot of times the federal government looks very sort of maternally to their programs and handholding, as opposed to understanding that the small businesses actually know what they're doing. They know their requirements. And I hate to say this, but if the government would just get out of the way, it'd be more successful. And so I would encourage, you know, taking a look at what some of those recommendations might be around the various programs, just the small business program, the HubZone program, others, like even if you're engaged with the agency with respect to the lending program, where are there barriers that just came about? And, you know, we did this analysis when I was at the agency at the time we were looking at the 8A program. What barriers came about as a result of, you know, an OIG report or one bad actor, et cetera, as opposed to looking at what makes sense for the program to operate smoothly and broadly and bring in more participants. So anyways, that's an area that they're going to be looking at. I'm hoping the agency will have a more formal process to engaging the public on this, rather than just sort of listening sessions that they do when they are at events. But I know that they had roundtables with you guys, so I think that was a positive outcome. And then the other executive order I think that was important in federal contracting. And initially, when this came out, there was a lot of concern, I guess, with federal contractors that, oh my gosh, we're going to have additional made buy in America requirements. What really has happened so far is just more transparency in the process, right? So the Made in America office, making sure that the requests go specifically to the office, making sure that there's transparency with those requests. So who's requesting them? What's the justification? And then if they're approved, making sure that that's transparent also. This is really about the supply chain, right? So as a result of the pandemic, federal government came to realization that our supply chain wasn't as robust and self-sufficient as it needs to be. So I think to a large extent, that is positive for small businesses, right? The federal government, again, casting a broader net, bringing in more participants, bringing in more small businesses, relying more on US small businesses. Those are all positive. So I think these are all positive outcomes. The one thing that I'd say, IT is a major concern, right? So making sure that the IT infrastructure is US based and that there's a strong supply chain when it comes to IT services, IT systems, cybersecurity, et cetera. And ultimately, again, each agency, aside from the transparency, each agency is supposed to do an evaluation of how they've implemented Buy in America, and then have a report to OMB and OFPP with respect to, hey, is there anything additional that's necessary? Are there some gaps? And do we need to update any federal acquisition regulations to make sure that those gaps are filled? Ultimately, that will go through the rulemaking process, so that's a positive thing. And the last thing I'd say here is they're even looking at, look, if you go to like a Forest Service park, other public areas, are those products, either the infrastructure, the benches, all those things, or just what's offered to the public, are those products made in America? And were there ever waivers to not made in America? So those are all, I think, positive, but it'll be a period of time beyond the transparency before any changes would occur, if any, with respect to federal acquisition regulations and further implementation of that requirement. Any questions there, Michelle?
They didn't ask questions, but with the Buy American, can you, like, how is that going to work with the whole reseller component? The percentage of it?
Yeah. So that's a good question. Again, it initially there's no change with respect to the requirements. So even with resellers and sort of around the non-manufacturing rule and going small, unless you have a NMR waiver, all of those things are going to remain the same for now. Now, obviously, when you talk about resellers, there's already been a significant increase in requirements around IT equipment. So there's a lot of restrictions on where your IT equipment can come from and what software and hardware are incorporated or packaged into your services or products as a reseller or a value-added reseller. Those things aren't going to change immediately, other than what, the restrictions that are already in place. I think what may change ultimately as the reviews are done is additional restrictions on requiring a lot of that infrastructure to be US made and US built and US serviced.
So is there going to be like additional, do you anticipate a lot more, certifications or requirements that companies are going to have to like verify, like pathways? I know that there's doing a lot of screening with the supply chain to, track down where specific components and parts are coming from. But a lot of times small, and like even the agency levels, personally, I know that's actually what my husband's working on from like a government perspective, is they're analyzing but small businesses don't really have the technology to really, dwindle that down.
Yep.
Do you foresee that this is really going to cause a hiccup for a lot of businesses that might be resellers, because, without having that, any thoughts there? I apologize. I'm not sure if I really articulated that question.
No. That's a good question. I mean, and that came out during our discussions at the conference. So look, I don't know if I have a clear answer to that, right? So there is a significant focus. I mean, we saw, and I forget what the software was over the summer, or maybe it was last summer. It was last summer with respect to the Trojan horses and the software and the access. We saw a significant amount of that. And there is a lot of focus on resellers and the supply chain and ensuring your supply chain is safe. And you're right, that it increases significantly requirements on small business resellers and value add resellers, and makes the burden for participation in the federal marketplace even higher, right? But that is, you're right, that is a direction that the federal government is looking at and very concerned. So if you're in that space, first of all, as you know, resellers are employee-based size standards. So even though some of the small businesses are, even though the businesses are considered small, they're by employees, so their revenues sometimes are relatively large, but that's the way that NAICS code works. So they may have the capacity to be able to do that. However, the smaller resellers, it is a challenge and a barrier to entry because of the requirements and the concerns that the federal government has. So I would definitely, as a reseller, especially in IT infrastructure, IT services, IT software, be concerned about and aware of those changes as they happen and come along, and stay attuned of those requirements, especially at the Department of Defense, because what happens there oftentimes trickles after a couple of years to the civilian agencies. So I would be very attuned to those with respect to a potential impact on how I procure goods for the federal government in the next 12, 18, 24 months. That's a good point, Michelle. So I know we're coming up on 9:45. I know
I'm not going
that.
to shut you off at any point in time, so it's completely up to you. So.
No, that's okay.
But I will stop asking questions, I promise.
No, this is good. I mean, the intent of the presentation is to be able to have a discussion. So it's absolutely great that you're asking the questions. I know the regulatory changes, you know, with respect to the various 8A, hubs, 8A, MPA, all those things were sort of discussed at the conference. And I know there's presentations and slides on those from the SBA. What I really wanted to do a quick discussion on is just the timing of some of these policies. And then I will go through really quick mentor protege changes. And I want to talk about category management real quick too. And some of the ways to address it. But real quick, one of the things we talked about at the conference, and I don't know if everybody was there that's on the phone, but when we hear from like the SBA or the Hill that certain provisions are being considered, right? That's the bottom here, right? So the laws, and oftentimes, even when they're being considered, they end up not being able to be tagged on to a National Defense Authorization, for example, or a CARES Act that's moving along, and sort of they sort of just sit there. Sometimes it'll be a standalone, but that's very rare. So when you hear about the laws that are being proposed, the statutory provisions, I'd sort of take that with I mean, understand it and understand what the Hill is thinking and what the administration is thinking, but sort of take that with a little bit of grain of salt, because even if it's passed, unless it's clear what the congressional intent is, then it has to go through the rulemaking process, right? And so that's a good process in my mind, but it can be a long process. So I'll give you an example. Women-owned small business program, the Hill agreed with us at the time that, hey, they should at least have sole source authority that's similar to HUBZone SDVOSB, because they had none. Now, at the same time, they said, oh, okay, you can have sole source authority, but you have to do front end certification. So when it came to the agency, it's very clear that they wanted sole source authority, but it wasn't clear the way they wrote the front end certification, how they wanted that done, because they said, oh, you can accept state certifications or third-party certifications, or you can do it yourself and you can charge. And so there was all these questions that industry should comment on before the SBA would move forward. So SBA moved forward and quickly for government with respect to interim final on women-owned small business sole source. So that probably took around, I'd say, 6 to 8 months. But the regulations on the WOSB certification took the better part of the next 3 years before that was implemented and finally implemented as a program, front-end certification, this past year. So timing, I think, is really important in how long things take. And then the other thing that I point out is when it goes through the rulemaking process, it'll go through public comment, right? So it's important to have great advocates like the council. You know, Sam mentioned this, and I was always shocked when I got into federal government because I used to chair an association before it, that the comments, actually every one of them has to be looked at. You know, they either got to incorporate it or explain why you're not incorporating it. So it's important to comment. And then something that John Klein mentioned, it's important to comment on the things you don't like and comment on the things you like, because they'll hear about all the things they don't like, and then they'll be like, okay, well, how about these things? Did anybody like them? So it's important to comment on both. And then the last point on this slide that I'll just put out there is policies are things we really should be concerned about because they can be implemented quickly and without any public comment or rulemaking or statutory authority. And so you look at category management. Category management was implemented as a policy by the Office of Management and Budget and the Office of Federal Procurement Policy as a way to buy more efficiently. And that's a great initiative. Who doesn't want to buy more efficiently at the federal government level? But it didn't look at all the statutory requirements around economic development, buying small, casting a broader net, encouraging more small business participation as it results in economic development, a stronger supply chain, a stronger industrial base. So that policy came about out of OMB. OFPP issued a memo, established goals, and quickly moved towards category management, which has had an incredible effect on the way the government buys and how small businesses participate in the federal marketplace. So while we kind of keep an eye on these things, it's really important to be able to see what's happening here and how this can actually have a long-term effect without any eyes on it. Any questions around that?
No. Mm-mm.
Okay, so mentor protege changes. The one or two or three quick things that I'll say with respect to MPA changes is that there didn't used to be a provision for sort of annulling or terminating that mentor protege relationship. And as you guys all know, there's an excellent program to team up with a more sophisticated firm. You bring your calls together, your past performance together, you can create a joint venture and pursue set-aside requirements. And the mentor participates because they can get up to 60% of that joint venture. But we want to make sure benefits flow from mentor to protege. You couldn't terminate that if it didn't work. And as a protege, you only get two. So it was important to create a mechanism to be able to terminate it if it's not working. And so now the SBA, through regulation, has said that you can terminate it within 18 months if it's not going well, and if you haven't consummated it in a joint venture with actual work under that joint venture. So that's a great change and a great opportunity. The other thing that's changed is that in the joint ventures, there was always the complicated 3-2 rule. Now it's just the 2-year rule. So as soon as you get your first contract, 2 years, that joint venture is complete. That doesn't mean you can't get the bids that were outstanding. It just means you can't put any new bids out. So that's another important clarification. And that doesn't mean that if you're under an MPA, you can't create JV number 2 and JV number 3 and JV number 4 because of the MPA. You're exempted from any affiliation concerns. And then the last, I guess, two things that I'd throw in there is that there was significant focus on the annual reviews to make sure that there's assistance actually flowing from mentor to protege. Although, in all honesty, I would say that that office is so overwhelmed that I'm not exactly sure who's looking at those reviews, but they are asking for them to be submitted in a robust fashion, and so that you can get your additional 3 years. And then it became clear in reg, although SBA was said maybe they could, maybe they couldn't, that the SBA can intervene in an MPA relationship at the request of the protege if the relationship isn't going well, in order to fix or right the ship. And then the last one, proteges are allowed, if it's not going well, to replace the mentor. Any questions around sort of the changes with respect to the MPA, the joint venture program, benefits of the MPA joint venture program? One of the things we discussed at the conference, and this was evident in the data as well, is that we are seeing, because of best-in-class vehicles, because of GWACs, consolidation, we are seeing more and more joint ventures. Like all our clients want to do a mentor-protege agreement and do a joint venture and bring the calls of both members to pursue these contracts. But we're also seeing a significant number of them being protested. And so when you set that JV up, you want to make sure it complies with all SBA regs, because you don't want to lose that contract on protest. So I think there's a question,
Yeah,
Michelle.
there is a question. I was just letting you go through that because it was good. As for JV, what is the purpose of the 2 years with the 6-year MPA?
Yeah, so it's interesting. That's a great question. And OHA has had some opinions on why that doesn't even make sense, because you can create second JV and third JV and fourth JV. But unfortunately, as it stands, because the JV rules technically are separate than the mentor-protege rules, right? The mentor-protege rule allows you to establish the mentor-protege, and it gives you 3 years plus another 3 years, so a total of 6 years. The JV rules, because you can have a joint venture between two small businesses. You can't have it without an MPA. Obviously, you can't have a joint venture between a small business and an other than small without an MPA. But so the JV rules are written in a sense to address both situations, with MPA, without MPA. And that's why there's the 2-year rule. Because if you had two small businesses that did JV number 1 and went through the 2-year time frame, and then they did JV number 2, and then they did JV number 3, SBA will find those to be affiliated, right? At some point, you do too many JVs between two small businesses without an MPA, they're going to find you to be affiliated. And so those rules are consistent for the JV program. However, since that JV falls under an MPA, you still have to follow those rules. So you have the 2-year program, 2-year restriction, but under a mentor-protege agreement, you can have JV number 1 with your mentor, JV number 2, JV number 3. The SBA has held that at any given point, they could say one JV is, one too many JVs is too many. But I've never seen the SBA challenge the number of joint ventures an MPA has, and I've seen like 5 or 6. So they've never found that one JV is just one too many. But that's the quirk in the rule. And Michelle, I don't know if I answered that question or.
I believe you did, but there was one thing as you were talking, I thought about it is, with a joint venture, you're entering into a binding contract. What happens if when you created that joint venture with the mentor protege agreement, it really may not have been as friendly to the company? It gives you more of an opportunity to, go back and maybe reassess those. Because once that contract's in place, and it's signed, I mean, they could amend it if they wanted to, but then they also may not want to, especially if you kind of got the raw end of the deal. So I feel like there is a frustration because it's like, okay, I have to do this again. But then it also leaves you a little bit of a wiggle room to not be locked into it and, have, renegotiate that. So honestly, I never even thought about it until somebody asked the question. And as you were talking, I was like, yeah, I guess it's got good and bad.
Yeah. And look, so you're absolutely right. If you have a joint venture and you sign an agreement with the government, first of all, the joint venture has to stipulate that even if your joint venture relationship breaks up, you still have to finish that project, and each member is committed to finishing that project. But it does allow you to, there's 2 things that I'd say. Is generally when we frame a joint venture, you want to create it in a way that each individual project is an amendment to that joint venture. And each individual project describes the share of the project and who brings what to the table for that project. That way it's not committed at the JV level, but for each amendment. And so you can renegotiate, oh, okay, on the first one, yeah, we agreed to give the mentor 60%, but on this one, we're only going to give them 40% or 50%. And on this one, we're bringing more of the resources. So especially that's the intent of the program, right? So as you grow and become more capable, you want to be able to perform more and more. So yeah, we do encourage each project to be an amendment and division of labor and who brings what, and performance is established on a project by project basis. But then, yeah, you can do JV2 and you can sort of renegotiate the terms. The one thing that I'd say is when we say be consistent with SBA rules, you really have to demonstrate that the protege is in the driver's seat in a joint venture. There are no significant unanimous consent provisions, and you can wholly demonstrate ownership and control by the protege, and no undue influence by the mentor. Mentors get a little, scared of those, but it has to be that way. Otherwise, you probably will not prevail on a protest, and that would be horrible because you spent so much time winning it. I know we're sort of running out of time. I want to talk a little bit about category management because it has had a huge impact. I know the SBA is very concerned about it. We heard about that last week. We know that there's pushback from the SBA with pushback with OFPP and OMB and GSA. But real quick, I mean, we all know that the category management sort of started off as strategic sourcing. It got a little bit better with category management because they were like, well, it's not always setting up these huge vehicles, but really it was. And then they said, we'll have these hallways, we'll just buy smarter, we'll monitor it, et cetera, and there will be cost savings. So one of the things was that, they wanted to buy more like industry. Should government buy like industry? I don't personally think so, but that's my opinion, and apparently the Small Business Act's opinion as well. But we won't digress. But the initiative was to buy like industry. The analysis that Bloomberg did in 2017 and pretty much has come to fruition was that because of this initiative, there was about 84,000 contracts to small businesses that would probably get sucked up into category management. So if you didn't have one of those vehicles, too bad for you. There has been success, right? Because there has been success in the sense that goals have been met. Small business goals have been met. If you look at the category management hallway on the GSA's website, it's great. I mean, they have excellent data. And I commend them with the tracking that they do. We should probably do this at the entire federal government level because they even have good sub-K data. But they are achieving great goals, but with fewer and fewer companies that have the golden tickets. And so if you're not, and by the way, categories pretty much cover every category in industry. I mean, I don't know if anybody on the conference call or webinar, it doesn't fall into one of these categories, right? And so here are the best in class vehicles that they're tagged or required to go to. And they have goals each year. And so it's in contrast sometimes to the goal of I shouldn't say sometimes, all the time, to the goal of casting a broader net, right? So you're not going to cast a broader net by going to these vehicles. You can potentially meet your small business goal, but again, you're going to meet it with a handful of small businesses that have the golden ticket. So this is what we were talking about. One of the things that we chatted with at the conference was the fact that small business spend is getting very concentrated, right? So if you look at the top 35 districts, and the top 35 districts, we mean where the most small businesses are headquartered. Well, I shouldn't say, yeah, are headquartered, where their primary office is. If you look at the 35 top districts, that's where most of the money went, right? So presumably, those are the more sophisticated firms. Those are the more entrenched firms. Those are the firms that have been around the longest. If you see the spend, the increased spend went significantly to those 35 districts. And then if you see the federal supply base, the number of small businesses actually getting one-off contracts year over year has dropped every year since 2017, right? Now, my opinion is that this correlates significantly with category management. There are other things going on, right? There are requirements to get in, just like Michelle, you and I talked about, the CMMC, the supply chain requirements, those types of ISO 9000, et cetera. But this significantly correlates with contracts being taken out of the small business program, one-off contracts, and being put into category management best-in-class vehicles. And then new entrants. So Tim mentioned in our presentation that firms actually registering in SAM to do work with the federal government has actually gone up every year since 2017. However, new firms actually getting contracts with the federal government, so more firms are registering, but less firms are actually getting contracts with the small business, with the government. So that's a significant negative trend towards increasing, negative on economic development just in general, right? And the authorities and provisions and the intent of the Small Business Act. But even beyond that, it's significantly detrimental to our supply chain, industrial base, et cetera. So there is significant concern with this trend, and there's significant initiative on how to address this, right? And then here's another interesting presentation, is that between 16 and 19, actually 138,000 contracts were reduced. 47 of them were large business contracts. 53% of them were small business contracts. So here too, we see that a significant brunt of the category management fell on small businesses. So what are some of the things that we can do? One of the things is SBA has significantly more authority since last year to look at requirements being pulled out of the small business program or a small business set aside, especially in the 8A program. But even if it's not in the 8A program, and being put or consolidated and put onto a best-in-class vehicle. So if we're seeing that, because the SBA doesn't have eyes and ears because of the limited number of PCRs, if we're seeing that, I would bring it to the attention of the PCR that's responsible for that buying activity. And if they're too busy to engage, I would raise it to the area director, right? So that's important. If we're going to see category management in these vehicles, one of the things that we established when I was at the SBA is that, okay, you guys are going down this path, this train has left the station, there's got to be on and off ramps, right? If you have the golden ticket, you're going to become other than small relatively soon. So there should be an off ramp. Now, fine, you're not off in the cold, maybe you get off onto the full and open, but you can't be on the small business set aside vehicle any longer. And there has to be on ramps for new participants to play. The second, the next two, there's got to be a small business track. There's got to be socioeconomic swim lanes. And then the next one is subcontracting, right? So if we're going to create larger and larger contracts and difficult contracts for small businesses to participate in, there has to be strong subcontracting plan requirements, and there has to be really close monitoring, transparency, and the ability to take corrective actions. And the Hill is looking at all that. That's another area where us as advocates should really be engaged. There are two things that are going on right now that have been going on, but SBA confirmed at the conference. One is just authorities around small business subcontracting and oversight. What kind of authorities does the federal government has? How is that monitored? How is it transparent? Why should it be transparent? Those authorities need to be strengthened in statute and regulation. At the same time, the federal government is working on enhancing its systems. So as you guys are aware, it's not always smooth, but we had the, FPDS, SAM, FBO, all those go into one system. They are looking now at consolidating subcontracting systems, ESRS, right? ESRS was at one point an SBA system. Now it resides at GSA. I was responsible for the system for years. So I'm the one saying this, right? It's a horrible system. It is antiquated. It is not transparent. It doesn't gather data well. That needs to be improved. So we have an opportunity, if where we are going to be participating as small businesses is subcontracting, we have an opportunity to increase oversight capability, increase transparency, and build the right systems to be able to do that. And then the other items that I just sort of throw out there is that, again, if the PCR you feel isn't being responsive or has missed something, we're the eyes and ears. We've done this a number of times for our clients. We'll send because these get through, right? We'll send an email or a letter to the PCR. We'll copy the small business specialist at the agency. We'll copy the area director. It's just sometimes as easy as bringing it to the attention of the PCR. It's important. The one thing that I'd say before I change slides, and I think we're almost done, and we'll see if there's any questions. It's important to re-emphasize, re-emphasize, and re-emphasize again the rule of two. I used to always have this discussion with Jackie Robinson Burnett when she was my deputy at the agency. The rule of two needs to be thought of first, right? You can't, as a procuring agency and a contracting officer, you can't say, I want to go to the schedule, or I want to go to Oasis or Alliant or any of those. What you need to do is analyze the rule of two first. And then based on your findings, say, oh, I wanted to go, there's two or more small businesses. And hey, by the way, there's two or more hub zone companies. Okay, now I know where I want to go. Based on this, which is the right vehicle, or is it a set aside, one-off definitive contract? So you can't say I want to go to Alliant and then do the rule of two. You have to do your market research and analysis before you start identifying solutions for your procurement. It happens the opposite all the time, right? We see it all the time. We come to the end of the year, they need to spend their money. They're not going to put up a definitive contract. They're either going to go to a schedule, a best-in-class vehicle, or they're just going to go 8A sole source. So it's really important to sort of drill that into everybody's mind. And the last thing here is a lot of folks don't know that you have an 8A sole source authority, right? Easy button. A lot of folks don't know that SBIR has very similar authorities. So if you have funding under the Small Business Innovation Research, and if you're not familiar with that program and you're developing innovation, either innovative processes, products, procedures, you may be able to get funding, and it's funding that you don't pay back, right? If you have funding under phase 1 or phase 2 SBIR, the government has authority to actually directly procure that product service from you in a similar fashion as the 8A non-competitive award. A lot of folks aren't aware of that. A lot of contracting officers aren't aware of that. So there's a significant initiative around making sure that those programs are used appropriately. Last thing I'll just throw out there is that follow-on contracts. It's important that the definition of a follow-on contract was re-emphasized in the November rule changes, not only for the 8A program and once 8A, always an 8A, but what I just explained earlier, right? If it's a follow-on contract, you can't just take it out and consolidate it and bundle it and throw it on a best-in-class vehicle. And so definition of what exactly is a follow-on contract was more formalized. I wouldn't say it's 100% crystal clear, but the SBA attempted to clarify what exactly is a follow-on contract so as to sort of slow down the tide of requirements getting pulled out of small business programs. I will stop
Before you,
there unless there are questions. Yes, ma'am.
so I do have a question though. So obviously you made the comment of the rule of two.
Yep.
Well, we all know that's not happening because the number of set asides is like literally non-existent. And it's kind of a joke. So why is it that they're able to constantly get away with that? Because this isn't specific to just HubZone, that's woman-owned and veteran-owned, which has the rule of two as well. But we know that they go and jump directly to the contract vehicles. We know that they traditionally either go small business or 8A. Like, why is it that if the language is there, that nothing happens if they don't do it? Because I mean, a quick Google search in 5 seconds, or even referring back to previous acquisitions, like there's so much evidence to support, and people say, oh, well, they didn't respond to the RFI, but like, is RFI the only requirement? Because we have all of this technology, we have all of the sources, like you could go into USA Spending or FPDS and in literally 30 seconds be able to prove rule of two, probably 8 out of 10 times. So I don't get it.
So there's two things that are going on. One is, look, on every requirement that doesn't get set aside, the PCR has to sign the form 2579. And so they will, again, limited resources, they will, unless there is reason for them to feel that the contracting officer is pulling the wool over their eyes, they will generally accept their file with respect to market research. And so, you know, the contracting officer can, you're absolutely right, can go to dynamic small business search. They can do a Google search. They can do a request for information. But and the other thing that happens when we talked about this, maybe we didn't, I talked to John and Sam about this separately. The other thing that happens is that contracting officers are making a competency decision during the market research phase. They shouldn't be doing that. I don't know how familiar this group is with the COC, Certificate of Competency Program. The competency decision is supposed to happen at time of award. So the SBA has the COC program. If a contracting officer says, oh, I would have given this contract to this small business, but for, I don't think they actually have the capacity to manufacture, you know, 1 million widgets, maybe 100,000, but they can't just not give it to that small business. If that's the reason, they have to ask for a COC from the SBA. And then the SBA, that was one of the programs I was responsible for, investigates that small business and then gives a certificate of competency saying, hey, you're wrong. These guys bid on it. They are actually competent, and we give them a COC. You have to give them the contract. Unfortunately, a lot of times that analysis, that competency analysis is happening at the market research. And we've talked to a bunch of clients that have said this. There will be market research and the contracting officer will, on his or her own, say, yeah, you know, it kind of looks like they could do it, but I don't think they have the capacity to do it. So we're not going to set this requirement aside. That's where PCRs should be pushing back. Unfortunately, two things. Some of the times they're not even aware that that's happening. Other times they haven't had the air cover and support to do it. And then the last is they're just overwhelmed, right? So a lot of times they'll just cookie signature, the 2579, great, great, great. And then the last one, this is a great one. I don't know if you've heard this term, Pcr shopping. So you wait for your PCR to be at the next buying activity or off on vacation or out on sick leave, and you send your requirement to Guam, and the guy at Guam is like, I don't know, I got tons of these, and just signs them off. That happens all the time. And before you know it, that requirement has a signature 2579 and they're off to the races. So it is the eyes and ears of us bringing it to the attention of the PCR and the area director when they're overwhelmed to stop getting these not set aside. And, sometimes the firms will be like, man, I don't want to be the complainer all the time. I'm going to get in trouble. Have, have the council send that. If you identify it, and I don't know, Michelle, if you guys do this, sometimes we do this for our clients, by the way. We'll send on our behalf, hey, there's a problem here. You need to look at this. I don't know if the council does that, but that's a way of addressing it.
That is something I would do. Please just make sure you do due diligence, because we don't have a huge staff, and say, listen, this is who the appropriate person is. Help me prepare the draft email. I have no problem if people are mad at me. Like I'm fine with being a buffer. I actually encourage our members to send it. And there's been occasions where companies were getting harassed, and I specifically encourage them to reach out to John, because realistically, his name is very, very well known. And if they think they can push you around, they will. So they obviously know that they can't push him around. So when he comes and says, hey, you have to abide by this, if they don't, you realize he knows the proper chain of command and the protocols that can be, so sometimes it's just putting around on enough polite pressure of saying, hey, we're watching. And if you're going to try to do this in another avenue, and that's something that we've really been, and that's where our partnership with Teaming Pro is to come into play, is let these contracting officers and these program offices realize that, hey, we are watching, like do it in a polite manner, not trying to call them out, but saying, hey,
Yep.
Here's the evidence to support the rule of two. But do you have any suggestions? Like, so when an RFI goes out, if they respond to that RFI, should at that point in time, they should be maybe including their PCRs on that communication, just kind of keeping them at bay, or is that kind of an annoyance?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So here's the thing. Remember, Sam, I don't know if he said this during the conference or maybe it was chatting with him, Sam Lee. So there is a period of time when it becomes too late. So if the RFP comes out and it's not small business set aside, that's really where the window is. Unfortunately, sometimes it'll come out on a schedule or a vehicle and you'll never know because you're not on the GSA schedule on that particular schedule, or you're not on the vehicle. So sometimes you won't even know. And then the other thing is, sometimes even if you do see it, there's a 2-week response period, and trying to sort of stop it during that 2 weeks is challenging. So it's a balancing act, right? If we know that it's not going to get set aside, then that's when we need to sort of push on the PCR. What I'll say is that the PCR probably has so much work that as soon as you respond to an RFI, if you let them know, they'll say, well, that's really, there's nothing I can do right now. They haven't made a decision. And I haven't even gotten the file to sign off on. We have some clients, by the way, that will do that. They'll engage. If they see a sources sought, they will write to the sources sought, and then they will engage the small business specialist at that buying activity and say, hey, just so you know, we responded and we're pretty sure there's at least 2 or 3 more small businesses that are our competitors that can provide this product or service. And then they just CC the PCR also. So that's one way of doing it. And, they get a lot of these emails. So they may be overwhelmed, but at least they'll know that, hey, wait a second, a lot of people were responding to this. So if it comes on their desk to sign off on the 2579, they'll have at least the idea or the information that you had sent them.
So maybe this is like opens up a dialogue between us and or other organizational partners like NBSBC and WIP and stuff like that, and say, hey, let's create like a running total, like maybe a chart of some of the opportunities that we're tracking between our companies, and send them a report versus everybody inundating them with emails. So us find a way that based on the targeted, I mean, obviously we'd need a better infrastructure, but because I literally just thought about this as you were saying it. So, but I think, do you think that would be easier on them instead of encouraging people to send the emails and just say, hey, these are ones that we're tracking based on set asides, SDVSB, women owned, blah, blah, blah. And then they could.
Yeah, I think, I guess and we'd have to think through it, right? My one just challenge with respect to that approach is how do we, the one thing is we don't know if they go on a vehicle that we don't have visibility into, or a schedule that we don't have visibility into. But we could keep a running tab of responses, or requirements that we're concerned about, and then inform the SBA on those requirements that we're concerned about with respect to being set aside. I think there's a way of doing it.
Mhm,
Look, I know that there's companies that'll do the individual thing, right?
mhm.
But and by the way, sometimes we get great responses and sometimes we get horrible responses. Like recently on one, we got a response from, and these guys used to work in my office and some of them are great folks. But we recently got a response from PCR that was like, "Oh, that's not my job. That's not how it works." And I was like, "Wait, what?" But the
I guess they
small
didn't
business,
realize it was you. That was a bad.
but the small, well, actually, our client sent that, and BCC'd me. But but the small business specialist immediately responded with, "Hey, I'd love to talk to you about how this can get set aside. What are your thoughts? And are there really more companies that can provide this product? And how do you think we can move forward to getting this set aside?" So it's not always consistent. And sometimes, quite frankly, the PCR is right on top of it, and very engaged. So anyways, there's different approaches. I think as a association, there can certainly be some sort of consolidated approach with where potential requirements are tracked, or even ones that we thought should have gotten set aside and didn't are tracked, and we can have follow-up discussions with the SBA with respect to, well, okay, here's an example. What happened? Why didn't the PCR advocate? Why did the PCR agree not to set this aside? To look at that and sort of learn from those, that would also be a great approach.
Okay, well, that's good. Yeah, because I mean, I don't want to annoy people. I mean, unfortunately, it happens a lot for
No,
the
I think that's a
really.
great part of yeah, look, so I mean, I agree. You don't want to annoy people, but as when I was running these programs, the associations and the small businesses are the eyes and ears, and the agency has such limited capacity that those eyes and ears can oftentimes be huge resources and an incredible level of help.
Okay. Well, now that we've put all those little tidbits in your brain too, I can already see
Yeah,
wheels churning. So just putting that out there. So I know we've kept you for 30 more extra minutes, and thank you so much for doing that. But before we lose them, do you guys have any other questions? Because this is your opportunity to ask him, because I know he probably has a full day worth of things to do as well. So um, it looks like we're quiet here. John, do you have any last minute comments that you want to share with anybody?
no, I just want to say thank you guys for including me in the conference. I appreciate it. It was a great conference. I think the council is doing a great job on advocating for the program. I think the fact that you had all sort of the key players, the program office, the OGC, the administrator, and it just brings great visibility to the program and what you guys are doing. So just congratulations, Michelle, to you and the entire team.
Well, we couldn't have done it without amazing speakers like yours. FYI, you got a lot of kudos about your presentation at the conference.
Oh, thank you.
And for any of you guys that are on here, matchmaking is open. We did add the additional buyers. Like Department of Transportation, as we mentioned, FAA now is recognizing hub zones, so that is a huge win. So we do have an inordinate amount of representatives from DOT that are participating, which I largely contribute to our advocate, Natalie, who is now the hub zone. In case you missed that, John, Lourdes's daughter, Natalie Martin Rosa,
Oh, yeah.
now the Ostabu and the hub zone and 8A, specialist for DOT
Where?
at Department of Transportation.
That's
Yes,
awesome. I
so
did
that
not
is
know that.
huge. Yeah, so that actually just happened. I meant to send out a huge blast and I've gotten so inundated. But Natalie, like they were partners with us with the LEAD program. And then she had went to one of like the PTACs out in Florida. And,
Yeah.
you know, she's done an amazing job and DOT just picked her up. And we had a preliminary conversation with the acting OSTBU. They just appointed their new OSTBU director. And on December, why do I say December? I don't know why I can't pick these dates. On September 15th, they're going to be doing a presentation. And they have lots of representatives. They got, you know, members from the program office at FAA, FHA. The new director will be speaking. And then, and this is all strategically positioned because they're coming out with a force on the 16th. I think we have like 12 representatives, even like programs people and contracts people. And I was like, geez, Natalie, you're killing it. At
Awesome.
first, everyone goes, I'm too busy. And the next thing you know, I have a spreadsheet. So
That's awesome.
So I just wanted to encourage any of you guys. And thank you again, John. Thank you for always being so wonderful.
Thank you, guys.
This will be posted later. And, you know, appreciate it. Everybody enjoy the conference and make sure that you tune in today because we do have some more sessions going on later on today. I believe at 1 we have Mr. Amtower that's going to be you know, participating. So don't forget, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at info@hubzonecouncil.org. And don't forget, Mr. Shiraka does provide his brilliant services. So check out his website if you're interested in potentially being able to utilize those wonderful services. Thank you again, guys. And I will, let's say, further ado. So sign us off, John.
Thank you, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.